So this is from our Office of Management and Budget. This is the office that works for the President of the United States. They're all the career civil servants, and so it's not a political office, but they're the ones that puts together the program plans and the budget on behalf of the president. So it's a very powerful office. This is an illustration that they put up just to show the relationship among the various goals. And so you can have, in this case, it's dealing with affordable housing. I apologize that it's hard to read on the screen. You can see the mission of the organization is to create strong, sustainable, inclusive communities and quality affordable housing. It then has a series of strategic goals under that, one of which they highlight: strengthen the nation's housing market. The strategic objective under that, several of them contributing to that strategic goal,
Sudah 40 menit lebih.
is to stem the foreclosure crisis in the United States. And then there are a set of annual goals that are underneath that. And then obviously the performance indicators that are below that. Within our system, and what we urge for others, the unit of management and the unit of real performance is at the strategic objective level. That's the level of outcome. That's the level of manageable outcome for an agency. And so it's, in this case, it would be to look to stem the foreclosure crisis in the United States. Among these, across the entire federal government, there's about 300 strategic objectives. So they really are at a relatively high level of outcome. If you consider everything a national government, our national government does, everything your national government does, I mean, they all basically do the same thing, of course, do it differently. There are 300 strategic objectives that are in place there. The point here is that then there are, each year, there's a strategic objective review that takes place for each one of those individual objectives. And these are required by our law, by something called the GPRA Modernization Act. It's in the selected readings that my dear colleague Aisha Washington sent to the organizers of the seminar. What the strategic objectives reviews do is, as you can see, they're annual assessments of progress towards the outcomes and opportunities to improve. And so they bring the full body of evidence and information together: analytic, research, evaluation, performance data, civil society organization reviews and perspectives, other government data. It's really sitting down and in a very direct way saying, where are we, to use that prior example, where are we on reducing the incidence of foreclosure? Foreclosure is people who can't pay for their housing and therefore are thrown out of it, basically. Where are we on reducing foreclosures? What are our strategies that we have in place? How are they working? How do we know that they're working? What do we need to do more of? What do we need to do less of? This is exactly what Governor O'Malley was talking about in his introduction, in which he said it's working the data and trying to get everyone working off of a common platform. It's there's that wonderful saying, is that we're each entitled to our own opinion, we're not entitled to our own facts. And so it's trying to get us all to work off of a common set of facts on this. These strategic objective reviews are to do two important attributes of them if they're going to be successful. First, they're going to involve top leadership. Is that if these are about the fundamental decisions the organization is being made, it can't be staffed out. They can get staff support. We can have people helping with the analysis, but at the end of the day, you have to make sure that top leadership is driving the process. And then second, you want these integrated into the as you can see, I put in quotes, the normal agency ways of doing business and talking. You don't want this to be some sort of standalone process that's over by itself, that, oh, it's March, we must be doing strategic reviews, and then we'll get back to, to our day job once all that's over. If that's what happens, it's usually not an important driver of decision makings. This is where those learning agendas that I talked about earlier come into play. This is where they're so important, because where you find information gaps, where you say we don't know how well we're doing or how much this program is contributing, that's where they sit down. And it doesn't mean that you zero out the program. What it does, though, is it says that we figure out What sort of data do we need to gather that would tell us how we're doing? What sort of analysis that we need to do? How are we going to get that information? How good do the data need to be? Because it doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be good enough in order to help us make the decision. Satisficing is often the term that's used on that. So this is where this is the nexus between looking at fundamental or looking at the outcomes, the results, thinking about in a results-oriented context, thinking about strategies to achieve those, and making those fundamental decisions based on evidence that we're going to need. In the U.S., we began these annual reviews in 2014. We took a year off, or we shouldn't say we, the executive branch. The Trump administration took a year off of these in 2017, but has begun to get back to doing them. We need to do a much better job on this. I want to be honest with you, is that this is something where the idea is there, the guidance is there, the instructions are there. We need to start doing this in a much more serious way, and I'd be happy to talk about kind of what some of the downfalls are if once we get to the Q&A aspects on that. Next on strategic plans are approaches or strategies to achieve those goals and objectives. This is a fairly common element of a strategic plan as well. However, under a traditional strategic plan, the strategies and approaches would be those just of your own individual organization. It would be, what do we do in order to achieve this? Much more broadly or more successfully are going to be the ones there on that bottom line. Of what are the relationships, what are the collaborations, what are the networks that are going to be in place. Let me go back to my traffic safety example with NHTSA. It could talk about just what it's doing and probably have a good agency strategic plan and say, well, we're issuing this guidance, we're issuing this education, we're working with the auto industry to see what we could do to make cars safer. We're working with our colleagues in the other part of transportation that pave the roads, or the state and local governments that pave the roads, to make sure we don't have potholes that that people are running into. They could probably have a good plan that way. But if they're going to have a results-oriented plan, or I shouldn't say since they have a results-oriented plan, what they focus on is not only their contribution, not only what do they bring, but how are they working through others to make sure that what sort of networks are in place to make sure that the results are being achieved. And so a key part of the strategies in a results-oriented environment needs to be those relationships and those collaborations in those networks. And that is, again, the whole of government level that I've been talking about takes place not just at a national level, but at a regional and a local level as well. In fact, in many cases, perhaps especially at a local level, where government is more likely to be delivering the services. How do you bring all of those together and make sure at the end of the day that there's coherence in the process? That's what the strategies and approaches section is designed to do. Next, a successful strategic plan in the new environment looks at the key external factors. Now, this has always been, there's the jargon, if you've done any strategic plan and you know what it's called the SWOT analysis, SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Your strengths and your weaknesses are internal, your opportunities and threats are external. I mean, and there's a lot of good guidance out there on how to do those. And I don't want to be deprecating on that. I mean, I think it's an important thing to do. Like everything else, if that's all an organization is doing, they're missing a vital part of the picture. If that's all an organization is doing is looking at the key external factors to its own activities, it's focused only on its own logic model and not on the results map, or on its position and its contribution as part of a results map. And so that's why the best of the organizations make sure that they systematically integrate into their ERM, their enterprise risk management program. And so they focus on those factors that are beyond their control, but which the agency seeks to influence if at all possible. And so that's why those partnerships are so important that I mentioned in the last slide. It seeks to identify the initiatives, regulations, and others of other organizations. And I should put, and when I said other organizations, I was clear on that, or I didn't mean agencies, because many times it's civil society organizations, the private sector. Who do we need to work with, or who do we need to have something done that can either help us achieve our goal or can hinder us? Either we can leverage them, or we can seek to minimize any negative impact that they may have. the enterprise risk management. There's perhaps we'll have a separate session on ERM at some point in seminars going forward. ERM in a public sector situation is absolutely vital to making sure that we're focusing on the key external factors here. So at the end of the day, what we're looking at is the strategic planning process to help us create and build a sense of what Vice President Gore many years ago in the United States called virtual organizations. And his point here, which I think was fascinating, and obviously when we get to Q&A, I'll be very interested in your perspective to see if this rings true for you. His argument is that once you get people to begin to think in terms of outcomes, think in terms of that result that's in the center, they're going to naturally start thinking about who else do I need to work with in order to achieve that result. So the organization, in a sense, will become virtual. It will break down from just being within the four walls of the agency or the ministry. It'll become much more of, I need to work with so-and-so in a different agency or ministry. I need to work with someone at a different level of government. I need to work with someone in the civil society or the private sector. We build these virtual organizations, and these virtual organizations, as you heard me use from the examples already, have several characteristics, or at least several ways in which they go about doing that. They very often will have cross-cutting goals. That is, that an organization will set a goal and work with, and this is the UNDP example that we saw at the outset, that will be a common goal that's set in collaboration with other organizations, so that they will be thinking about how they all work together and point towards a common outcome. There'll be national plans that will be put in place. That national biodefense strategy that I talked about in the U.S. We have a national cybersecurity strategy. We have we have all sorts of different national strategies. A national response plan for natural disasters. One of the big breakdowns, as I mentioned, in our COVID response is that the biodefense strategy was not effective, was not used in order to address that. And as evidenced by, that we're the global leader in deaths, which is not you don't want to lead the league in that, being the global leader in deaths is a function of we have not had a national plan. And in fact, if you did follow any of our presidential election, that was one of the major points of contention by Vice President Biden, now President-elect Biden, was we never had a national plan in place. It was all haphazard, different task forces given off to the states. And so these national plans, doesn't guarantee you success, but for big cross-cutting wicked issues, it's hard to be successful without one. Many times also we've seen in the past where a lead official or lead agency will be put in charge and identified with this. Oddly, in the US, these are often called czars. Right after the Russian, excuse me, the pre-Soviet Russian, government, the czars. And so we've had literally hundreds of czars in our existence since Herbert Hoover, the president back in the late 20s and into the early 30s. And so we appoint czars for everything. It's a fascinating. I'm not sure exactly why we do that or why that term has become very popular with us. I know several years ago I was talking with some colleagues over in the Russian Federation and mentioned about that we call them czars, and they laughed at me and they said, "Well, Chris, we don't, you realize that we don't use that term anymore in Russia. We don't refer to our leaders as czars." And I said, "Well, we still do, at least for these lead officials that will be put in charge." And that's, for example, I mentioned Admiral Allen earlier. That's what he was. I mean, it wasn't particularly called that, but I mean, in effect, he was the czar for Hurricane Katrina, the czar for for Lower Manhattan. Again, the term wasn't in that case applied to him, but it was characteristic of that. Very often, we'll form interagency task forces in order to coordinate cross-cutting programs. And so we have, for example, one of our most successful ones is an interagency task force to eliminate homelessness in the United States. If you've been to the U.S. on travel or business and been to any of our major cities, you see there is very visible people that are rough sleepers that are living on the streets. Doesn't mean that they're not in rural areas too. They're just more hidden in rural areas. And so we have a big homelessness problem. We have over 50 different federal programs that contribute to or seek to contribute to limiting homelessness in the US. And these, very similar to those food safety programs, each individual one is very, very smart and well organized. But if they weren't all working together in a coherent and collective way, then we would have we wouldn't have overall rationality. One of the biggest problems that we've had, and I realize I'm referencing this on National Heroes Day, is homelessness among our veterans population. These are people that have fought our wars. They come back and they don't get the support that they need, many cases because they have PTSD or they didn't have skills that help them transition to the private sector, and they're homeless and living on the streets. And it's never right. I mean, I don't want to, but it just strikes me as being especially wrong for people that have sacrificed on behalf of the country, put themselves in harm's way, that there's a homeless population on that. And so what we had under the Obama administration, our Department of Veterans Affairs and our Department of Housing, two different ministries, work together and say, we're going to really try and crack this issue of veterans unemployment, veterans homelessness. They made some great progress, but it's not all the way there yet. But that's an example of an interagency task force. There's a set of other coordinated solutions that's being used. I do want to though just spend one moment just on what we have often found is the least effective way of dealing with a cross-cutting issue, and that's a reorganization. A colleague calls that boxology, and he gets that from boxes on an organization chart. And as we know that very often when a new leader comes in, her or his first inclination is to reorganize. I want to move the boxes around. Now, it doesn't mean that that's never the good idea, because there are good and not good forms of organization. So I don't want to be heard as saying, oh, you should never reorganize. But too often we've seen where we will put organizations together, we'll reorganize, and we'll say, well, we dealt with that problem. Thank goodness everything is all coordinated now. When in reality, that's not the case. You've just kind of moved a bunch of boxes around. This is a bit of the story with our Department of Homeland Security. After 9/11, the agency was formed, actually was a couple years later, brought together 22 different agencies. At that point, over 200,000 federal employees, many, many more now, and many more contractors now, into a single department. And they said, well, we've dealt with that problem. Or in effect, they said that. And that they didn't, not at all. All you did is you just brought people together and you changed the acronym after their department. Rather than being in this agency, you're now in the same agency. That doesn't guarantee that they work together. That doesn't guarantee that they're effectively coordinated. So I guess the most important problem with boxology or moving things around is not that it's wrong to do that, but to understand, as I was saying at the outset, with the biodefense strategy, you need to make sure you have a change management strategy in place. You need to make sure that this is something the Department of Homeland Security did not do, and therefore their performance was undermined for a number of years because they weren't able to discuss with people their role in the new organization, and so that and where they fit and how those pieces are all organizationally are going to all come together. So let's move quickly now to the third element that I wanted to cover this evening, and that's the role of leadership in the new abnormal. And as I said at the outset, I don't think we'll ever get back to a new normal. Or if it does, the new normal will be abnormal and constantly changing. Taking the governor's wonderful line of expedited change will be our way of operating, our normal way of operating going forward. What does leadership look like in that environment? Well, what it looks like is exactly what Governor O'Malley is saying, and I should say that I've had the opportunity to study some of the things that he was doing, and so you can tell I've been deeply influenced by what he did at Maryland and at the state of Maryland when he was the governor, and then when he was the mayor of a city, in a very, very difficult city of Baltimore. But he talked about how leadership has traditionally been seen as is this hierarchical, as this pyramid. You know, bosses have people that are under them, who then have people under them, who have people under them. And many of us still work. I still work in a hierarchical organization. I've got people that work for me. I have a boss, you know, and all that sort of stuff. But at the end of the day, leadership is now much less, I want to suggest, about directing and supervising a single unit, much less about your direct reports, and much more about boundary spanning, and which requires skills in facilitation and negotiation and relationship building, overseeing different policy tools. I challenge you, think about the people that you are dependent upon doing something for you to help you achieve what you want to achieve, an outcome that you want to achieve. And I'm willing to bet that most of them do not work directly for you. People that work directly for you, it's relatively easy, just like our bosses for us. It's relatively easy to get them to do what you want them to do. You tell them, you say, hey, I want you to do this. And, you know, you have a performance appraisal at the end of the year and you say you did well, or you did less well, or you did great, or whatever the case may be. Far more challenging is getting people who don't work for you to do something for you. That's where those skills of facilitation and negotiation and relationship building come in. You're trying to convince people that are already fully occupied with their time, let's work together on a common problem. It happens successfully all the time, but it's just a different set of skills. That's the point that I wanted to leave you with. So a first set of skills that leaders need today are these kind of soft people skills, that boundary spanning, facilitation, negotiation. A second, not surprising from everything that we've been talking about this evening, is using data and evidence to pinpoint improvement opportunities, put in place learning agendas, and affect change. Third is managing risk, and not just the risk of an individual program, but that systemic risk that I was talking about earlier. That is having a vision that understands a risk across an entire delivery chain and understands where is the risk in each link in that delivery chain. Fourth, it's making sure that we have employee engagement and increasingly working across generations. The younger people are coming in with different points of view, different assumptions of what the public service will be about, different assumptions even about the what is entailed in the public service. When I came in, public service meant government. Now it means it certainly means government, but it also means much of the NGO sector would consider themselves as part of the broader public service. And so, but let me deal with the first part on employee engagement. And I'll show you some slides particularly on that in just a few moments about the importance of employee engagement. It means creating lines of sight. This is part of what leadership does. A line of sight is the ability to have a conversation with people that you're working with about how what she or he is doing contributes very directly to the outcomes that the organization is trying to achieve. Now, their individual task may not be, all that sophisticated. It could be kind of mundane, processing a form, writing a report, something like that. But people are going to be most motivated. They're going to be most engaged. They're going to work the hardest when they have a very clear line of sight between what they're doing and the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. It's true for us individually, right? Is that, why are we involved in this program? Why are we involved in whether you work for government or academia or the private sector or civil society organizations? Why are you caring about trying to deliver meaningful outcomes for your fellow citizens in Indonesia? You care about that because it's something big and important that you want to be involved in for them. You're going to do your best work. Each one of us is going to do our best work if we have a clear understanding about how we contribute to that. All I suggest is that the same things that motivate us motivate the people that work for us and motivate the people around us. And so to the extent that we can have discussions on lines of sight with people, you can get improvements in performance. The reason I spent time on this is that this is no cost. It is it's just a matter of having a conversation with people. It doesn't require a lot of technology. It doesn't require any bit, kind of sophisticated stuff. It's just getting your team together and saying, where are we in terms of the outcomes? How are we relating to those? How are we contributing to those? Is there something we should be doing more of or something we should be doing differently? And then finally, leadership today is about driving organizational change. It's understanding, it's having in place a change management strategy and making the effective changes that need to be made. Let me give you a more concrete example of what I'm talking about here as we deal with people, is that people are an organization's, obviously they're the most important asset that an organization has, especially in government today, where we're largely knowledge-based organizations. And so it affects our capacity to perform. Our knowledge base is all in our people. I had one colleague a while ago put it, I think pretty neat way. He said, the great challenge of management is that every night at the end of the day, the organization's most important asset walks out the door. We as managers need to create a culture that they're willing to walk back in the door the next morning, that it brings them back in, and so that's the challenge that the people challenge that we face. People are also important because they're, in many organizations, they're a large cost driver, for the organization. The bottom line on that is as we've been alluding to or speaking directly to throughout the session, is that effective human capital approaches are going to be the cornerstone of any serious change management strategy. The breakdowns in all of these government-wide whole of government plans that I've been talking about, as you saw, has been because we have not had good change management strategies in place for people. Don't worry, I'm not going to read you all of this. This is just a set of survey questions. This is actually the subset that is given to federal employees at the U.S. government each year. And it asks for a whole set of questions dealing with leadership and work-life balance and everything. These are just the questions that are part of what's called the Employee Engagement Index. We did some statistical analysis and wanted to find out, among all of those, which are the questions that are most directly related to more engagement from employees. And we focus on engagement because the academic literature has shown that engagement, more than satisfaction, more than improvement, engagement is what gives you better mission performance. And so you want engaged employees. So what are the questions that are most important? And we found that there's 6. One is, my supervisor provides me with constructive suggestions to improve my job performance. I'm giving a real opportunity to improve my skills in my organization. My supervisor supports my need to balance work and other life issues, probably particularly important, even more so today. This was done, before the COVID. Supervisors work well with employees of different backgrounds. They scored high on the question of how satisfied are you with your involvement in decisions that affect your work, and how satisfied are you with the information you receive from management on what's going on in your organization. And so while all of these questions are good and important, what I would urge you to do, and again, this isn't just at an agency head level or minister level. This is at anyone within the organization. You will get improved performance from your teams. The data shows if you focus on these 6 things. Now, I need to stress that these were done in the United States, and so I don't know the extent to which it's culturally sensitive. That is, that it wouldn't translate into another environment. And so again, this is one thing that you need to look at this and think about: would this work in where we are? However, I can tell you in presentations, many of them I've made globally, I haven't had a lot of people say, no, that's nonsense. That wouldn't work. No, and in our country, we don't care if supervisors provide us with constructive suggestions, And so I think there's a bit of an intuitive feel on them. But again, you need to make a decision of what works best for you. So within all of this, there's a number of key performance indicators or key performance improvement initiatives. We've talked about strategic planning and how that's different. We've talked about leadership attributes. We've talked about employee engagement. And now this is actually towards the end, where we're going to talk about, very briefly on just a couple of these that I haven't covered already. Some of these I have: agency strategic plans, strategic objective reviews. The one I want to focus on is what's called quarterly performance reviews, or performance stat. And this is what Mayor O'Malley did in Baltimore and what he did in the state of Maryland. Although in Baltimore it was called City Stat, And then in Baltimore, it was called state stat. So what exactly was this? In 1994 in New York City, something called Comstat was born. And this was 94. And so they think it's, no one really knows, but they think Comstat came from the notion of computers and statistics, and they just kind of put it together into Comstat. But the basic idea here was to bring data together. And a guy named Jack Maple was responsible for this, working with a police commissioner, Bratt, was using maps to put what they called cops on dots. The dots would be where they would have crime. And so if they knew there was a high crime area, or on Saturday nights, this is something bad's going to happen there, they'd move cops on there before Saturday night. And, in hindsight, it all sounds very obvious, but at the time it was path-breaking and revolutionary. This is the Comstat model. So it happens in 1994. Crime in New York City goes down significantly. Murders went down between 1990 and 2011 by 80%, robberies by 83%, burglary by 86%, car thefts by 94%. Now, part of this, there was a national trend towards crime going down in the United States, and directly showing causal relationships between Comstat and crime reduction is very hard to do. And it's been, kind of analyzed and controversial as to what relationship it was. But in general, the evidence seems to point that it helped in that regard, or that it at least contributed to it. The point is that what began as a law enforcement then spreads into other types of programs in New York City, whether it be parks, whether it be transit. And so it's Comstat. So then what happens is that Martin O'Malley, he runs for mayor of Baltimore in the fall of and he wins. And Baltimore at that point was a very, very troubled city. I mean, it still is has some real troubles of poverty and racial injustice and crime. But in the fall of 1999, he takes office, and he gets Jack Maple to come down from New York City and work with him to set up CityStat. So he takes the scale of just focusing on law enforcement and takes it to an entire city level. The reason I mention this is that it was very cheap to do. It cost them less than $20,000 to do this. In direct, it's basically some screens where they could project the data, in a couple of Excel spreadsheets, was the early data. And so the first CityStat was held 6 months later after he became mayor. And as I mentioned, the technology was about $20,000. Now there are additional staff costs, because they did hire some people. So the overall cost was about $350,000 to $400,000 which is not an awful lot given the level of change that they got. They focused first on areas where data were already available. And a lot of that was overtime and absentee rates among city employees, and then built out from that to the actual outcomes that they were trying to achieve. The key points to all of this is that as Mayor O'Malley or Governor O'Malley was mentioning, this was a leadership strategy that they were using in order to track common data against outcomes and make real-time changes. And so they would have these meetings, and I managed to sit in a couple of them in Baltimore and see how they work, in which they would get the mayor chairs this meeting. They get a program official up there, and they take place every couple of weeks, and they're going through the data, and they're saying, what are you trying to achieve? What last time you said you were going to do this, you were going to fix this. Did you fix it? Did it work? Is it something that we need to change? There is one of the articles that I suggested in the readings is by Bob Bain, who is the great academic that has studied the performance stat movement. And in fact, he came up with the term performance stat. And he talks about all the various attributes and ways in which, in a very concrete way, in which performance stat has been successful. Mayor O'Malley then becomes Governor O'Malley, and he takes it to the state of Maryland. State of Washington also had a version of this. It's called state stat at that level. The reason I go into these in some details is that the question had always been at each level, does it scale when it gets to the next level? And the answer to that is yes. So Comstat worked, and it scaled with some adjustments when it got to CityStat, and it scaled with some adjustments when it got to StateStat. And here he's running a jurisdiction exactly like Jakarta, running a jurisdiction using this performance stat model. It's a very powerful model to drive improvement and drive change. That is, if the leader is willing to invest her or his time, because it is fundamentally a leadership strategy on what it's done. At the federal level, we have done them with both on topical stats called, with IT and human capital dashboards. And then in legislation beginning in 2010, we required them at the federal level. Rather than every 2 weeks, they're once a quarter. But if you go on performance.gov, that's the website of federal performance, and you can see for each of the agency priority goals, those are the major goals that are statted at our level, what their quarterly reports are showing, and how they're doing on the progress. These, I won't go through all of them because it's part of the readings, but it does show you the attributes, or rather the key practices for an effective performance stat. And so I'll hit just some of the highlights. First, as I've mentioned a couple of times, is that it's leaders are using it as a leadership strategy to drive performance improvement. If a leader doesn't want to use it, they can't staff it out. It can't be successful that way. They need to actually be personally invested in it. They make sure that they have all the key players at the meeting. They actually hold meetings. These aren't things where paper is just passed back and forth. There is a meeting where everyone gets together and they're all talking about and working the data together, and all the key players are present. They review the alignment between the goals and the activities and the resources, making sure that we're all pointing in the same direction. They hold managers accountable. Very often, the first question of any meeting is, what did we agree to do at the last meeting, and did it work? And because we've all probably been in things on committees in which we get together and, someone will be a committee, and then after about an hour, someone will say, this has been a great meeting. Thanks. We'll get together next week. And you're thinking to yourself, we've done nothing. We've accomplished nothing. And then you get together several weeks later and, another great meeting. This has been fantastic. No, we accomplished nothing. It's all been still talking. People, blah, blah, blah. What these are is they try and break down that. They say, no, we're going to get together, but we're not wasting people's time. We're going to start with, what did we promise to do? Did it work? And if it didn't work, that's fine. Let's try something else. If it did work, do we do more of it? Or do we, try something else? Effective stat sessions do spend time making sure that the agency has the ability to collect accurate, useful, and timely performance data. That is, the data has to be available when the decisions are being made. They make sure that they have staff with the skills to analyze and communicate that data, the data visualization. That's some of the performance stat skills that I mentioned, that extra personnel. They make sure that there's rigorous preparation, usually by a very small team of analysts that go through the data with agency officials to make sure that they understand the trends and do the root cause analysis. Those reviews are on a frequent and regularly scheduled basis. It's not something that they do once and then maybe another time several months later, and then maybe once more and then they're done. It's not like that task force that I was mentioning, the food safety working group, that met a couple times and then just kind of, let's declare victory and say that, we made great progress when we really didn't. They're regularly scheduled. They're on the calendar. Everyone was there. And then, as I mentioned, participants engage in rigorous and sustained follow-up on those issues. Time after time, at level of government, this approach has been shown to be able to drive performance improvements within organizations. I would also mention just one other aspect of this. It's also can be used by each one of us, no matter how small or large our own organization is. Top leadership just doesn't have to be the governor. Top leadership isn't someone just the minister. It can be done for someone running a unit, running even a task team. Obviously that, how rigorous it will change. But it's getting your people together periodically on a scheduled basis, saying, how are we doing against the outcomes? Let's all work off of a common platform of data, following up on what we committed to do in the past, see if that worked, and then moving in a different direction if it did not. Single most important, one of the big change management initiatives I'd urge you to consider. At the end of the day, what's our great challenge? What's the challenge as we look to expedite change? And this is not an analytic slide. I mean, it's because there's a bunch of, kind of just, words on it. But I mean, the current state of too many government organizations, not all, but too many, is that they focus on outputs in their own activities. They operate in stovepipes and hierarchies. They focus inwardly. They micromanage rather than giving the authorities and the flexibility of tactics that Admiral Allen mentioned. They're reactive. They wait until a crisis occurs. They avoid technology. They hoard knowledge. They seek to avoid risk rather than understanding if we want to achieve something big, we're going to have to entail some risk. And they're all about turf protection. What we need to do is transform government using a set of these key practices into high-performing organizations, because the types of issues that we have, COVID-19, climate, transportation, urban economic development, housing, they all demand different results-oriented organizations and high-performing ones that are focusing on results, that understand matrix and networks, that are flatter and more horizontal rather than hierarchical, that are externally focused, thinking about what we can achieve and how, that empower their employees, and they use proactive rather than reactive approaches. They're about leveraging technology, as I showed you in that chart of kind of the 7 attributes, and they're about sharing knowledge and managing risk rather than minimize it. And they look to form partnerships with others that are involved. At the end of the day, what this is about is employing not just the logic model for our own individual programs, but fundamentally thinking about results maps, thinking about our place in that results map and who else that we need to work with to be effective. The old traditional categories of management, it's not as though they go away. They just become different and more important and more vital, that when we think about what strategic planning means in this environment, what leadership means in this environment, what employee engagement means, and ultimately how we work data in order to assess our performance and seek to improve the performance on behalf of our fellow citizens. With that, my dear friends, let me conclude the comments, and I look forward to any questions and feedback and issues that you may want to raise. Moderator, thank you, sir. Back to you.
Thank you, Prof. Chris, Mim. It's been a rich, informative session from you as the keynote speaker in this session. You've brought about the complexity, the complexity of the issues within now, the current, even in the future, and how the policies are being made throughout that complexity, and then going inside more into the practices. I think just before going to practice, I think I'd just like to note that it's very intriguing on the egg story. Yeah, it's very simplified understanding on the complexity of, I mean, every government would have all around the world, right? And then you have the more cross boundaries, and then you have the complexity of climate change. That gives a very, very excitement, but also scary phase for us to face for challenge. And then going inside the practices and also the leadership in need in that's something that have practical information for us. And I would just like to inform you, Prof, that within the workshop that we're holding, there are half of the participants are from DKI, but others are also from external agencies, externals as in state-owned enterprise, local state-owned enterprise. And then we have also universities, and also we have from the central government agency. So it's going to be a rich perspective, and it's exciting because while you were talking, there are a lot of comments and a lot of questions coming through the chat room, and I guess I would like to start to have a Q&A session. And I would try to build up the questions as I go, choosing from the first question. I think this is very interesting, from Ibu Ika Idris. She's from the Paramadina Public Policy Institute. She said that she's been working on evaluating public policies for the past 2 years, even work with the top leader of an agency. The challenge that she found with bureaucracy is to make sure the policy is implemented. In an organization with a higher power distance, such as the National Police Agency or military, when the leader ordered the policy to be implemented, all the structures will secure that policy. So the hierarchy model works. However, in low power distance agencies, such as the ministry level, a good policy does not necessarily apply by the working units. Could you advise on how to lead effectively and efficiently without having to be authoritative, like the military?
Yeah, wow, that's such a great question, and it's absolutely true. I mean, I agree with you. Although the um, I agree with the fundamental premise. Although I think we need to be careful in that, we've seen, or at least my experience has been, is that many senior military officials also complain that they think they're being very clear in their direction, and it actually, once it gets down to the ground, it's completely different than what they thought they was ordering. And so, but the premise I still take to be exactly right. I think that the most important thing that we've seen on this is to engage in discussions with people to make sure that they understand the common purpose. And perhaps the less nice way of saying that is to understand why they're not doing, why they're not implementing it. In some cases, it just may be that they're completely overworked. In some cases, it may be that they don't understand the priority or their role in helping to implement that, or why what they're doing is important. And so it's I don't want to go too far and say, oh, this is going to be this is the magic key. You turn this and all of a sudden everything's going to be perfect for you, for the rest of your career. But to the extent that I've seen these roadblocks and confronted them myself, where I think that it's just crystal clear where we need to go, and I'm like really confident in saying it, getting my team together and saying, let's get this done, guys. This is great. And then come back later and find out that people are all scattered in different areas. It's often been a failure on my part to really communicate more the why and not just the what. And that is the what is, this is what I want you to do. But it's also, I find that I need to communicate the why part of that. This is why we're going to do this. This is why I think it's important. This is why why it will make a difference for people. It gets back a little bit to that line of sight point that I was making, is that assuming that people come into the public sector for the same reasons that we did, to achieve big outcomes on behalf of our fellow citizens. Fortunately, the great majority of public servants that I've run into, that's their motivation. Just like everything else in life, you're going to get maybe 1 or 2 out of 100 that come in for a different reason, that is to get the paycheck. But the overwhelming majority come in for all the right reasons. And so it's being willing to have those discussions with them, and frankly, as a leader, to also hear from them, and be willing to adjust tactics. To the extent that people come in with better ideas. And I often find that the case is that I'll think we need to go in a certain direction. Once we start getting the why, then I'll get from the people that actually know much better than me, that are actually doing the implementation. Well, Chris, that's you do that, and that might take us off in a different direction. How about if we do it this way? And as long as we end up at the same point, that's going to be perfectly acceptable.
Well, so I guess the key to that, highlighting, if I may, it would be the engagement and the communication, right? And continuously having that feedback towards that. We have another question here, and it's also in the same line of concern from Ibu Elianti. She's from the education department in Central Jakarta. And she mentioned that agencies' collaboration and network management requires agency and office to stop operating like silos. So, that's the complex problem, and that's what she's feeling in Jakarta. What would you suggest the practical steps? That you have those, you mentioned those steps, but as a government leader needs to change this. Maybe in talking also in practical from her point of view in the unit inside of a smaller unit inside of a bigger organization in that sense.
Yeah, that's another just outstanding question. It's hard. I want to, the first thing I want to do is straight out acknowledge that it's real hard to do. That very last chart that I showed you is, of kind of the old way of doing business and then transitioning to a results-oriented organization, is that if many of us are caught in an organization that's hierarchical and hoards knowledge and stovepiped and inwardly focused, all the things that I was kind of articulating there, it is difficult to be a change leader within that. One of the things, though, but it's not impossible, and that's the important part, is that there's plenty of literature on leadership, and so this is taking me beyond kind of the work that I've been doing, but other literature on leadership that has shown that certainly positions of power within the organization and where you sit on the hierarchy is important. But there's also this notion of what's called catalytic leadership, and it's a lot of the insight from the whole human relations movement of the 40s and 50s and even before that, kind of brought that, is that in many cases the most important people are their positions of power and influence marbled within the organization, of people that by either their personal attributes, what unit they may need to be, they could be in, their knowledge, the size and strength of their network, they're able to exert influence. And so I would, on the one hand, sympathize and understand the challenge that you face, wanting to work collaboratively in a stovepiped organization. What I would say, on the other hand, is that it is possible. And I think one of the things that is most helpful on that is, in a sense, to find allies. I think one of the very best things about this program, and when we started out, my talk, there was over a couple hundred people that were on. This is now part of a network. Formed a virtual network of people that kind of get it, using the quotes. And I'm glad that I see it's dropped a little bit, but for my own performance measurements, I'm glad it hasn't dropped too much. Because I'm a performance guy, and so. But I mean, it's the. I think what's important is build your personal networks. Talk to your colleagues in either in that own unit, and I don't mean this in some sense of subterfuge or anything like that. Be very open and say, we're both trying to achieve this. We're working towards this outcome. How can we coordinate what we're trying to do, or how can we better work together? At the end of the day, you may run into some fundamental roadblocks that are going to, just at the top, not facilitate that organization. But I'm confident that you'll also have opportunities, as I mentioned, that Vice President Gore said. This was during the Bill Clinton administration back in the 90s, of the virtual organizations. Of once we can start talking to people about the outcomes that we're trying to achieve, they're going to naturally start thinking about outside their organizational walls, and that's very important. Stovepiped organizations are output organizations. They're only thinking about their own activities. And if we can break them out of that, we can have success. One of the things, again, I think that's most important about the seminar, over the several weeks that you're going to be together, and I'd really encourage you to keep up in contacts, and the people that, where you're going to be working on the papers, keep up in contact with your mentors. These are people that can help you think through these problems and can be key allies as you're looking to build a virtual organization.
Great. Well, actually, inside this, from DKI's part, most of the government officials are sort of level echelon 3 and echelon 4. So you're correct that this is the start of them gathering and building that network towards a bigger goal. And I hope this is the start of that. There's another question from Pak Radityo from the Wali Kota Jakarta Barat, and he's interested in hearing from the US side perspective of bureaucratic reform. So here's his question. Related to global public policy management revolution for government to be more transparent, customer focused, and quick process, Indonesia has introduced reforms to its bureaucracy in response to critics of the quality of government policy design and delivery. How can we learn from USA from the bureaucratic reform that can be applied in Indonesia?
That well, it's let me a couple things on that, and I will directly kind of get to the question. I think though that the beauty of acknowledging that there's a global public management revolution is that nobody has this in a sense licked, right? Is that so? I mean, I look forward to learning from you. You know what you all are doing. I mean, I know that you're quite advanced in the use of delivery units. Which originated in the UK. Governor O'Malley used it, but that's not something that's widely dispersed or as widely dispersed in the United States. And so, I mean, there's the beauty of where we are in the moment of public management is that we all need to learn from each other, which is why these international seminars are absolutely so important. And you know, notwithstanding what the governor was saying about we can do this all virtually, I've only had one opportunity in my life to come to Indonesia. And so I want this darn COVID to go away. So some point in the future, I can come and visit you all and you know, when we have, you know, a seminar in the future. So anyway, so you know, there's a lot of learning that needs to go on globally amongst each other on this. I think that we have some things that we can lessons to learn. I think, you know, some of our lessons though are also lessons of failure, and you know, or successes are also cases in which, you know, the flip side is when we haven't followed them where they haven't worked. I think it, you know, one of the most important aspects on this is. And this gets back to a little bit to the very first question as well about leadership, is that making sure that or the first question on implementation, making sure that we actually are thinking through what does the implementation look like? You know, how are we going to implement this? I'm sorry, that's not very clear. Is that we have we focus on a lot of the major programmatic breakdowns, and what we often find is that there's kind of 5 root causes as to what leads to a breakdown, and therefore 5 things that address a breakdown, a management breakdown. One is just a failure at the leadership level, and that is, and it's not just a tone at the top, but it's also providing the resources, in a sense, the permission, the staff, the dollars in order that are needed very often to fix a management problem. Sometimes these management problems, they do need extra investment. You see that a lot of time in IT problems or certainly human capital, you know, personnel problems. We need to hire more people, you know, or we need to better deploy the people that we have. So one of it is a failure of leadership. The second is, and directly related to that, is a failure of capacity. And that is not having the right people, the right skills in the right place in order to affect change. The third, and probably the most important, is an action plan. And that is to, you know, and a lot of this is just the basic project management that we're all, you know, we're trained on and probably pretty skilled on. And that is, you know, what do we want to achieve? In this case of addressing a management issue, what are the milestones? Who's going to do what? How are we going to track performance? How are we going to make changes that we're going to be doing? Basically, you know, not having an action plan in place, I think, is, you know, we often see is a problem in addressing management concerns. Fourth is a lack of effective monitoring. That, you know, that is actually tracking that progress over time. And then the fifth is then making sure that we get demonstrable results from that monitoring. And so we've seen that there are a common set of problems that lead to breakdowns and a common set of solutions that are associated with that. But fundamentally, the beauty of the management moment that we're in now is that we're all learning from each other. I spend an awful lot of my time back in the old days in airports, going around the world, you know, learning from colleagues about what they were doing, trying to share some things that we were doing, but fundamentally knowing that it's on management, it's very, very much an even playing field, which gets back to, you know, your wonderful comment at the beginning about this is of the Q&A, which is, it's a little bit of a frightening time, but it's also an exciting time. And I absolutely agree with you on both parts of that, is that, you know, I think that this moment to be involved in public management both because of the nature of the challenges that we face as in our societies, and the fact that we're all kind of grappling with the solutions makes this among the most exciting and kind of intellectually funnest times to be involved. I mean, it's also very nerve-wracking. I mean, climate change is real, and COVID is horrific and all that, but it's also exciting. If we can pull this off, this will mean just fantastic stuff for our citizens.
And learning from I mean, both sides, as you mentioned. Jakarta has in Indonesia, I think, especially in Jakarta, we have a vehicle, Professor Chris, a vehicle which is the local state-owned enterprise, be it in transportation, infrastructure, water management, wastewater management, tourism, and so forth. There's a question here. I'm not sure how it works in the US, but regarding to that, we have a question from Pak Andi Nurdin from one of the local state-owned enterprise, Jakpro, Jakarta Proper Indo. They're focused on infrastructure, mainly transportation, big facility, stadium, the recent stadium that we're building. They are held of that. So the question from Pak Andi is, as one of the regional-owned enterprise in Jakarta, and agrees with the pages on climate change, pandemic, social justice, human rights, governance, and so forth, as a company, is it relevant if some of the livability development goals owned by DKI Jakarta are transferred to the company? The livability development strategy needs to be aligned with the state, local owned enterprise portfolio in the future. For such a situation, how can we balance the company's goal, which is profit-based, right? But also with the government's vision and mission on high impact. So they have this great balancing act, because their KPI, in one sense, is actually making the company a viable business. But in the other sense, there's a non-profit goal, which is impact for the people, and that's one of the arms that the governor is using in Jakarta. Maybe you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, and I'd like to learn more from you on that, in the sense that we don't have in any meaningful way state-owned enterprises in the United States. That for us, the equivalent model would be either contracting it out to a straight up for-profit corporation, or privatization, where we would just sell it to the private sector. And so, our electric grid, our transportation systems, they are, they're all privately owned. I mean, the closest that we come is, we do have some public-private partnerships with, toll roads, but, not in any kind of meaningful way. But the larger question, I think, is it gets to the importance and the challenge overall of balancing performance measures. I mean, it's your colleague there is asking it, and I think, and I can understand, as a state-owned enterprise, it's particularly acute there, where they have both, profit-making responsibilities, economic sustainability responsibilities, and fiduciary responsibilities, while at the same time they have social responsibilities, why they're state-owned. But we see that goal tension in even in programs all over around government. Whether or not it's not always the financial goals that are balancing off, but you have various competing goals that are embedded within agencies, and how there's no one right way, other than for them to be very forthcoming and transparent about the trade-offs that they're making and the consequences of those trade-offs. And so, for example, we have agencies that are responsible both for the economic development of government-owned forests, while at the same time making sure that those forests, so they contract with logging or sell that to logging companies, while at the same time making sure that those forests are there for future generations. And you see that with our Food and Drug Administration, has responsibility for the safety and security of medical products and devices, while at the same time helping the market develop. And so there are tensions that are embedded in many of our federal agencies and well, in virtually all programs, it's kind of an efficiency effectiveness trade-offs at times. What we've always urged agencies to do, what I've always urged agencies to do, is again be very transparent about the trade-offs that are being made, and involve your stakeholders in those discussions. That's exactly what they're there for. Is that or stakeholder engagement. That's the whole purpose of it, is to get them to help understand the trade-offs that you're making. I don't mean to keep going. It was a wonderful example from a program that our Environmental Protection Agency, that's our kind of climate agency, had a number of years ago, was something called the National Environmental Goals Project. And what they did is they held a whole series of community meetings talking about and trying to get agreement on environmental goals. And it wasn't like at the end of the day that business and the environmental community all kind of hugged and said, oh, it's been a misunderstanding. We all want the same things. No, they didn't say that. They really disagreed. But at the end of the day, two things. One is that nobody could claim that they weren't consulted. And as we all know in government, the very worst thing that can happen to you is if someone says, they never talked to me. They didn't ask me. If they had only talked to me, I could have helped them, that sort of thing. So everyone was consulted. And it educated the stakeholders on the trade-offs that you were making. Doesn't mean they agreed with it. The Greens environmentalists wanted more towards the environmental side. The business wanted more towards the business side. But at least they understood the competing pressures that you're under. So I think transparency and stakeholder involvement are absolutely the key there. Although, again, I recognize that, with state-owned enterprises, it's particularly it's a particularly acute issue in your world.
Yeah, it's actually very complex. Being there, seeing it myself on how it works, and I think you gave a spot-on comment on forthcoming. I mean, just talking about do you want us to do this, and we have consequences if we do this, to the company itself if it's okay, And that's sort of the communication that we have to build against a better goal to both sides of the agency. Because if not, at the end of the day, there would be a complexing opposite impact, both for the development itself or even for the company. And